Thank you guys for being here and being on time. Heather's going to share a link in the chat to the slides so you have your own copy as well. And while you are logging in, first of all, if you can make sure that you put your name and your school or work location in the chat, please.
Thank you all for doing that. Welcome everyone. For those arriving, we're requesting you put your name and your workplace in the chat. Let us know you're here.
And once you've already done that, I'm going to put this question here. So if you're just getting here, please first tell us your name and your work location. And then if you've already done that, we'd love to hear. It's the end of Black History Month, and curious, is there anyone you're listening to, reading, watching, learning from? Who have you engaged with recently to further all of our work towards growing our perspectives, anti-racist beliefs? Tons of good examples here.
Another Louis Armstrong fan I see. Very nice. Dr. Kendi, yes.
Du Bois.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, yes.
It was actually dual consciousness, the concept by Du Bois that I read my sophomore year in college that opened my mind and my world. And that's when I actually started really reading.
Oh, wow. You made you a reader, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Me and White Supremacy by Layla. Yeah, that's powerful. She's done that whole workbook on that. Really cool. Lots of folks saying Amanda Gorman, Jason Reynolds, Michelle Obama. Yeah, we asked this question to a group yesterday and someone said Obama's biography and we were like, which Obama? And some folks were reading Michelle's and some folks were reading Barack's or listening to Michelle's. I hear that listening to Michelle's on audiobook is really powerful because she reads it. Yep, there you go. Morgan is reading both. Nice. Interesting. Belonging through a culture of dignity. Yeah, Hidden Figures. I just saw that movie again recently. Amazing story that I didn't really know about until then. Mm-hmm. Awesome. So if you just got here, please make sure you also put your name and your work location in the chat. Okay, I think I'm trying to keep track of letting everyone in. Thank you guys for helping with that.
Well, welcome for those arriving. Please put your name and your place of work there in the chat. And we're reflecting on a question here about who have you been influenced by this month? Or just Black folk, African Americans throughout your career, especially.
And to our team, one of us has our notifications when I just heard the ding.
Yeah, I think that's me. And I thought I had them turned off, so I will double check.
Jackie Robinson, what a great inspiration. Fascinating story. Yep. Satchel Paige. Wonderful. I love this list. I learn new names each time too of other people to look up and to learn from as well. Mary Jackson. Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris's book. That sounds like another one to add to the list. All right, so I think we've got 148 folks here. I think that's pretty close to who all is coming. So thank you guys so much for sharing who you're learning from. And as Heather said, we learn from you, lots of new folks to continue to grow our repertoire of knowledge. And thank you for, again, putting your name and your school or location in the chat. And so we're actually going to hand it over to your superintendent just to kind of kick off our conversation for today.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation and engagement in our learning together. Your feedback is also really appreciated and considered carefully as we're monitoring and adjusting along our journey. I want to draw your attention to the triangle on the screen, which I know you're all familiar with by now. The systems illustrated here are very much related to our strategic plan in all areas of teaching and learning, culture of care, communication, family engagement, and even finances. This year, we're laying the foundation for building learning structures and practices that will grow our data literacy for analysis and help us make better, culturally responsive decisions that best serve our students. This work is comprehensive and it's taking place from our classrooms to our boardroom. I'm participating as well as board members. I'd like to point out that our board president will be with us, Karen Reich. She is doing all of this learning along with us, and I am following up with the rest of the board by sharing what we do together and working through the asynchronous work just as you are all doing. On behalf of the school board and myself, I look forward to building the systems represented in this triangle with all of you. Enjoy the next hour of learning.
Thank you so much, Mary. So as Mary said, we are taking your feedback really seriously. We hope that today's learning reflects that, and we will continue to be seeking your feedback as we support you all in more asynchronous learning in the coming months together. So very quickly, you guys have seen me now a few times. I'm Courtney Dykos, one of the co-founders of Continua Consulting Group, and I will hand it over for Heather and Vince to just remind you of who they are as well.
Hi, everybody. Heather Sweeney, and just super excited to be here. And hopefully we can really dig into some special education conversations today. Passing it off to Vince.
Thanks, Heather. Vincent Perez. Kind of my jam is equity work, juvenile justice, which I'll get to be going back into the institution very soon. Very excited about that, and really honored to be serving your district.
Thank you. Heather, you want to kick us off with our purpose?
Absolutely. So we have 3 goals in our conversation today. We're going to be talking a lot about mental models, and specifically our mental models of special education, kind of identifying where we're starting and beginning to co-construct where we're trying to get to. And review the purpose and the function of special education today. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that, and then also review what are the qualifying categories within special education, and what does all of this look like in a public school setting. So that's really our big conversation today.
And for our expectations for today's learning, we invite you, right? It's always an invitation, not a demand, at least from our Continua perspective. We will get to invite you, always easy, like that chat up, y'all. Like, we really want to engage that way as a learning community. We'll be in some small breakout rooms of 3 to 4 folks when we do some processing as well. And we invite you to turn your cameras on when possible, especially when in those breakout rooms. However, abundant grace for all, technology, for each other, for life, when we have to adjust to that expectation. The slides will be available via Google Link. I know Heather's working on putting that in the chat, and we invite your gratitude as well, right? Always to share and celebrate one another in this good work we call school.
So just wanted to kind of review, we really look closely at, thank you so much for all of your hard work in Canvas and to figure out with each other as a team, how to get into the module, what is the module asking, working on your norms. We're going to actually ask for some additional feedback at the end of today on how far you've gotten to ensure that we help you finish up that process. But wanted to remind you a little bit of why are we doing that work that feels somewhat disjointed to talk about norming when we know that there's this urgency around inclusionary practices and trauma-informed MTSS and being culturally responsive. And so part of what we wanted to do, these ideas of efficacy and culture responsive practices were landed on last year in support of your administration. But wanted to kind of show how do these different themes all come together. And so what we know is that collective efficacy, this practice of us coming together, setting the rules for how we'll engage safely and honestly, and at times challenge each other's thinking in a way that still feels productive and supportive. How will we look at data and question our practice and stay really low on what we call the ladder of inference to make sure we're not jumping to conclusions, but better understand what the data is telling us. What do we then design as an action plan? How do we communicate about that? How do we monitor what we've done? That's all critical technical work to drive this much more adaptive, trauma-informed MTSS, culture responsive, inclusive work, right? So we know that helping you all come together in some evidence-based ways to ensure that you're on the same page as collaborators is going to then really build the foundation to learn those culture responsive practices, again, to reflect vulnerably on the history of your community. Where have students succeeded and not? What are some of the biases built into our own belief systems, as well as our practices and policies as an institution? So Vince will be continuing to help us grow all of that learning. And as Mary said earlier, then identify what does that mean for our practice. Next year, we'll be really shifting into those practice pieces. And then this inclusionary practice project, the opportunity from OSPI, really includes all of these. In fact, Heather earlier, as we were preparing, was talking about how if you go to the OSPI resources for inclusionary practices, their first module is all about collaboration. So they've identified that if we're going to change services for students identified with disabilities, if we're going to shift our mental models and really ensure that all students have access to the least restrictive environment, ensure that we all have a growth mindset and that's embedded in our inclusionary practices, we can't build any of that without strong collaboration to start with. And so all of that is to say, we put our triangle right here in the center, that there is an overlap of these different ideas that all comes together with that trauma-informed multi-tiered systems framework. And so when we talk about being culture responsive, that is absolutely the foundation of the work. Understanding the impact of trauma, understanding of the culture of our students, how have they felt validated or not validated in the past? What does that mean for us as an institution and in our classrooms? That is at the foundation of trauma-informed multi-tiered systems of support. And what we know is that at all three tiers, we need strong implementation teams that are collaborative, that are leaning into that collective efficacy, using data, which is what we're going to get into next month. We're going to unpack a couple different sources of data and empower you with these collaborative teams to start to look at that data with your team as well. And then eventually to say, well, what are the evidence-based practices we need to implement, and what does professional learning look like? That's true at all three tiers of trauma-informed MTSS. And again, collaboration is at all three tiers of that work. And when we think about inclusionary practices, we know that tier one needs to be strong for all students. And that means all students are general education first. And Heather's going to get more into that qualification and conversation later. But when we think about inclusion, we're ultimately talking about students' access as much as possible to be involved and included in and viable members of that tier one setting. But we also know that we need evidence-based specialized tier two interventions, right? Those should be matched to student needs, they should be progress monitored, and they shouldn't be permanent. The reason that these arrows are here is because if a student has a tier two need, we should be able in about 6 to 12, maybe 18 weeks to resolve that need. And that student should continue to be in tier one and then go back to all their services being in tier one, for example. And when we talk about tier three, there's often some debate of whether or not special education is even part of tier three. But if we look at tier three through the definition of individualized, an IEP is definitely an individualized plan. And again, we want to see this as a place not necessarily where students live in that individualized support forever. It's not necessarily permanent, but it should be evidence-based and connected to what's happening in tier 1 and tier 2, right? So these arrows, again, are really important as we think about all of this work together. This really is an MTSS framework that we are very much at the foundational stage of helping your system develop collaboratively. So I'm going to shift and let Vince kind of talk us a little bit about mental models. Hopefully that was helpful to kind of see the big picture of where all of this is going.
So we want to invite you to really kind of expand our mental models, our belief systems, the way we see and perceive the world. This is a little reminder from a session a while back, right? It's been a little while, but if we put on a pair of, yellow shades, they see the world in yellow, and that's colored by your life experience. But the way we see, for instance, a parent with a 3rd grade level of education will determine how we act towards them, right? The way we perceive what that is and who they are in that. So we want to invite you to think about the idea of a tree again. And if we are like a tree, our mental models are rooted, right? They're thick. They've had some time to grow there. And sometimes our work is unearthing these mental models, seeing what they are, and analyzing them for change, seeing if we want to make any shifts. And so when we invite you to think about your mental models of ability and disability, what does that mean? What is your mental model of what a special ed is for? And how was that formed? We had our teacher education. We've had the various districts we've been in. We've seen different things. And so as we consider how our careers have been influenced by the systems we've been embedded in, right? And how that shapes, especially if you go to a new system. I do want to say this one little anecdote. Some of you know that I have a little sister who was blind since birth, 5 years younger than me. When I was 10 and she was 5 years old, I taught her how to ride a bike. And so the mental model of a blind person riding a bike, and we had to do some memories, think about the mapping the space, right? She couldn't just like ride all around town, right? But what was possible, we made possible. And for many, that just the concept of that is, right? And so I think when we think about ability and disability, I think we have to invite many questions in to investigate and probably unearth and unlearn some things, especially if we think of special education having a mental model as a place versus special education as a service.
Thank you, Vince. And that's an excellent segue. And so really, this is a solid example of a shared mental model that has been in place in society. And when we get into the next pieces, we'll talk a little bit about the historical context and why the laws and the policies are constantly evolving in this world. And so we had a shared mental model as a community in education, not just in Mount Baker, but across the United States, that for a long time, special education has been a place. Students go to a certain area to receive support. And that was kind of how we thought of things. We now have some new research, some new information, and that starts to shift our shared mental model where we really want to think about special education as a service. And we're going to dig more into that. And so go ahead, Courtney. So let's dive in and think a little bit about the historical piece here. And so this is a simple timeline of civil rights for people with disabilities. And really where the law started impacting the world of special education was in 1975. And what happened then was, after the civil rights movement, there was a lot of momentum to start thinking about how do we deinstitutionalize what's happened in our country up until this point, and really in through the 70s and the early 80s. These places existed where we warehoused people with disabilities and people who had mental health issues or needs, and we did not treat them the way that we would want to be treated. And so we had to put laws in place to fix these things. So 1975 was really the beginning of that. And then we saw a pretty dramatic shift in the 1990s. And for those of you who were around either in school old enough to remember or teaching at that time, this was when the idea of mainstreaming really caught on. And that was the language that was used, that students should be mainstreamed who have a disability. And if we think back to the graphic from last time with all the little dots, what that really meant was students who have disabilities are allowed to be in the classroom, but they weren't always necessarily, the classroom wasn't designed or thought about in service of them. It was really, they just had access. Go ahead and click again, Court. And so as this work kind of started to evolve, really the big idea in the 90s was that students who are identified as having a disability and had an IEP, they had a right to make progress in the general education curriculum, but there wasn't a ton of guidance yet on how that should go. And then we had a shift in 2002 with No Child Left Behind. And take it or leave it for whatever it was, but one of the things that happened with the No Child Left Behind implementation was a standardization around data collection and analysis and the disaggregation of data specifically to review our students who have been identified to receive special ed services. And in 2003, I just want to read the statistic. In 2003, 33% of students with a disability dropped out of school. But by 2014, which is a pretty, in the world of education, is a pretty remarkable turnaround, we saw that dropout rate decrease to 18.5%. And it's because of the standardization around looking at data, having some common ways that we are talking about curriculum and what does progress really look like, and that being equitable across school districts, states, at the federal level for them to be able to analyze this. And then the last shift that's really been impactful in our work is in 2015 with ESSA. And what ESSA has done is it has provided some more specific guidance to really beef up what started happening with the original 1990 version of IDEA. And so the ESSA Act, what that does is it allows students to not only have access to the general education curriculum, not only to feel successful in that general education curriculum, but it requires us to really think about what are our practices and the data analysis and the progress monitoring we're doing, not only once students are in special education, but how are we qualifying students? Are we really thinking about the full picture in an MTSS and an RTI framework of how students are even getting to that place to make sure that we're identifying students who truly have a disability and not just a gap in knowledge? And so that was a really big shift that's come out of this work. And so, you know, as we move through this, we really want to be on point and talking about that special education is for students who have a disability. And we're going to talk about what those criteria are. And not only that they have a disability, because lots of people have disabilities that do not require specialized individual instruction. But what an IEP is for is really those students who have both a disability and a need for individualized instruction that's not available to the general population. It is something significantly different. And so when we talk about these qualification categories, these are the federal categories. The state categories are named a little bit different, and we'll talk more about those when we get into our data. But I really wanted you to have a common foundation in the federal law. This is our guidepost for all of our work in special education. And so most of these you're familiar with: autism, blindness, specific learning disability is one I really want to highlight. As we talk about specific learning disability, this has historically been the category that is used, has been over-identified for our students farthest away from educational justice. And so Washington State is a leader in a lot of work happening around who really should be in this category and what does that actually mean. And so we've developed more parameters around how a student can qualify under this particular disability category. It used to be just kind of a blanket statement. And we need to be very careful with that moving forward, because the data has shown this is where our over identification often comes from. Another area is around what in the federal category is called emotional disturbance. In our state codes, we talk about emotional behavior disorder. And what we're really talking about here is students who, as you can see, have anxiety or schizophrenia, maybe deep depression. And these things are truly impacting their access to the general education curriculum so much that they really need some specialized instruction. Often when we talk about students who have qualified under emotional behavior disorder, what a lot of the new research we're finding is many of the students who are qualifying in that category, one, it's highly overrepresented by our African American males. And we're also now better understanding the impact of trauma on the learning environment for students. And many of the students who have historically been qualified in this category probably don't have a disability, but had experienced some form of trauma in their childhood. And that was the impediment to their learning. And with the right interventions, the right supports, those things could have potentially been addressed in a different way. And so we just want to highlight that as we're moving through this work, there's these categories, but the categories are very specific, and special education must live within these parameters. Okay, go ahead, Courtney, unless you want to add something.
Well, and I wanted to say two things that I just wanted to re-emphasize. I think you said it really well, that historically in education, we have overutilized both of these categories, but especially that specific learning disability category is a place that historically we have labeled students or given students that qualifier when often they are furthest from educational justice and may have gaps in learning, not necessarily a disability. And we know, as you just named, that especially this emotional disturbance category is where across the country, we have overqualified males of color, and it is often referred to as the school to prison pipeline, because if you enter that category in the United States, you are more likely to go to jail than you are to graduate. And that is statistical data across multiple school districts across many decades. And so just wanted to emphasize again the equity issues of leaning on both of these categories more than the actual disability would qualify for. And the other thing I wanted to name that I know your district is working hard on is that some exciting growth in our state is that we're now being expected at K1 to measure the potential for dyslexia because it is so prominent among students. And we have historically under-identified dyslexia and then struggled to teach those kids as readers. And so just wanted to plant a seed if you're not familiar with it yet. I know Ian and others are working hard on screeners and other ways that starting next year, you'll be actually qualifying whether or not kids at those grades and kids older have dyslexia. But that's another trend we've seen over time.
Thank you. And so when we talk about the world of special education, we're not just talking about the students. We're also talking about who is at the table for this work and for the support and to implement these services. And really, it's all of us. There's nobody left out of this equation. It truly is a team effort. Everybody you see here, if you see your job title here, you are part of the service for students who have been identified to have an IEP. And the more we come together, the more we collaborate around student need. We have conversations about what are the accommodations, what are the learning targets, how are we progress monitoring, all of the moving parts that are involved in special education. If we can put our heads together and distribute some of that labor, that understanding, and that support, the students feel it, the families feel it, and I guarantee you, you guys will feel it too. It'll take a huge weight off your shoulder when we start to really solidify what are these collaborative practices that are going to support this work so it can be an all hands on deck approach. And so I would like to request for an elementary staff to maybe unmute and read this these first two paragraphs here. Can I just get a volunteer?
I'll do it. Special education. Numerous studies since the 1970s have concluded that separate education in a separate setting for students with disabilities has not only led to minimal academic gains, but also has negative effects on social and academic outcomes. There is now ample research on the benefits of inclusion for students with and without disabilities to support a system-wide change. Schools and educators need to adapt systems in education to build on what is known about learning and needed for teaching diverse students, including students with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Julie. Go ahead and click Courtney. And I would love for a high school representative to volunteer to read this next piece, please.
This is Holly, I'll do it. Initiatives for inclusion must transcend general and special education silos, entrust bold leadership, apply innovative instructional strategies, engage families, and leverage related services.
Thank you so much, Holly. And so as you're thinking about this, we really are talking about a very significant paradigm shift in education, and it is no small feat. And so a big part of what we wanted to emphasize today is reassuring you that this year of work is really about understanding, collaborating, building some of these foundational pieces, reviewing the data, getting underneath the data so that we can better understand what are the problems of practice that we need to address, and developing our action plan that will then direct our work starting next year. And so this is really about us all being on the same page around the bigness and the importance of this work. Go ahead and click, Court. And so when we think about the barriers, we know that they exist. And so we just have to be honest about those, and we have to plan, and we have to be intentional about what are the barriers we need to address first in our work. And so as we think about these, there are a lot. And so part of what we're doing with our work now around shared mental models and our collaborative practices is really getting at what are our perceptions of disability? What are stereotypes around disabilities? What are those traditional models and expectations? So all of these pieces really talk to our shared mental model and getting us all to row down the stream together. Are we all trying to address the same barriers for a more inclusive environment? And so this is another graphic out of the handbook, and I just wanted to put a little bit side by side. These are all of the systems we're going to be talking about. Like, it's not just one piece. If we try to address just what's happening in the classroom, it's really not going to get at the bigger structural needs of the system. And so really from the heart of the circle of instructional strategies, you'll see as we move out, collaboration is right there. The stronger our collaborative practices, the more impact, and the quicker that impact will happen as well when we all work together. So I just want to constantly reinforce that the collaborative work we're asking you to do really, really matters, and it's directly tied to the outcomes that your system is trying to achieve. Go ahead, Court.
Sorry, I had to get to the mute. So just wanted to, again, we look closely at the feedback and had conversations with your administrators after you guys have delved into the first module. And we knew there was some confusion and wonder about this information in particular about collective efficacy and Hattie's meta-analysis where we've learned about effect size. So I just wanted to explain a little bit more about what this slide is actually saying. So first of all, when we say effect size, really what that means is how much does this particular intervention or this approach actually affect student learning? And wanted to clarify that, unfortunately, not only in the US, but actually globally, the effect size of a typical student's year's growth is 0.4. What that means is, on average, the average student without intervention, rather than growing an entire 1.0 year, grows a little less than 1/2 of a year in terms of gaining mastery of standards and grade level equivalencies. So we're already starting off with the majority of our kids not growing a full year every year. And often that kind of blows people's minds. And yet you can see it, right? In terms of how we've seen students struggle year after year when they're not gaining all of the competencies that we know that they need to be successful the next year. So knowing that that's the case, and if we don't change anything we're doing, then the majority of students will grow a 0.4 worth of growth on a 1-point scale every year. What we know is that if we account for things like students' socioeconomic status, what's happening at home, how much their parents are involved, we can start to move the needle a little bit on that effect size towards more like half a year's worth of growth. So these things matter in terms of us intervening, but they don't necessarily move that student all the way to 1 year's worth of growth. The next big thing we want to notice is that when we really focus on feedback, really informative feedback based on success criteria where kids can measure their own growth and understand where they're going, we know that we can now almost double that effect size and get to 3/4 of a year's worth of growth, which is wonderful, much better than 0.4 by far. But what this is showing is that in schools where you have really strong teacher collective efficacy, which we keep talking about, that belief that as a team, we can achieve with students, we can lean on each other. If I'm not good at something, I know who on my team is. If I need to get better at something, my team helps me do that. We can look at my students' results and someone else's students' results. And if they did better than I did, I'm not taking it personally. I want to know what they did. I want to grow what I'm doing. When teacher teams work on a regular basis where the data of their instruction is really informing what they do, and when they believe that every student they teach can learn, then we see this effect size jump all the way to almost 1.6. So this means that kids that go to schools where collective teacher efficacy is in place are growing 1.6 years every year. So we've quadrupled the average results in schools where teacher collective efficacy is strong. I'm hopeful that that helps clear up what this is saying. Please let us know in feedback if you have more. I see there's some comments in the chat. I'm going to move us to the next slide and then I'll check on what that says. But I'm teaching here, so I'll wait just a second. I'll let Vince and Heather look at the chat and let me know if I need to add anything. So the other thing that we've talked about a lot here is that collective efficacy really informs special education and inclusion. And this comes straight from the Inclusionary Practice Project Handbook from OSPI. So for us to make inclusion possible, that collaborative practice has to be school-wide. It has to mean that our mindsets and beliefs are that if we collaborate, we will be better at what we do. Which I think in COVID, we've seen everyone, especially you all in Mount Baker, really at times shift that belief and realize, wow, I am a stronger teacher when I can lean on my colleagues because this is hard and I need their help. Where we might redefine folks' roles and responsibilities. And in a moment when you go to breakout, we're going to ask you to start to think about that. How does your role maybe look different in the future as these practices become part of what you do? You must have the opportunity as educators, we must have that to really develop how we communicate and collaborate. We must be really strategic if we're going to engage in co-teaching, for example, which we know a lot of you are really curious about and would like to implement. All of these pieces have to be in place for successful co-teaching. As I often say, co-teaching is like a marriage. The collaboration must be culture responsive. So just like when we talk about working with our kids, we've got to be respectful of each other's cultures and differences and inclusive in how we even relate to each other. And we know it has to be not just with our Java-like peers, but we've got to do some of that K-12 articulation and work across grade levels and environments as well. So this is really at the heart of all work that you do as a system, is to build those collaborative practices.
And just to pop in, somebody asked just a quick question about the self-reported grades and student expectations, because that was right under collective efficacy.
Yep.
And just so you all know, that really is a direct reference to success criteria. And so how well do students know and understand what success of any given task or standard actually looks like in practice? And when students really have ownership of that success criteria, then they can goal set on their path to meet those success criteria. So that's what that's in reference to, and it is extremely high.
Okay, anything else from the chat, or I'm going to keep us going?
Yeah, there are a few more questions. Actually, if you want to stay there, Courtney, sorry, my bad.
Oh, okay, I'll go back because we're going to go to breakout soon, but go ahead, Vince.
Question about attendance. What does attendance factor in?
So, you know, that piece I think we'll have to pause on because we don't want to go too much into the Hattie rabbit hole right now, but we will share links with you and other ways you can look up this information if you're curious about those individual pieces. But there was a question about the growth per year versus effect size, apples and oranges. So the function, and Courtney, please jump in if you need to. The function of an effect size, it's a measurement model that was created back in the 50s to be able to take a variety of research components that all talk to similar kinds of outcomes, but were different pieces of research. And so the only way to turn apples and bananas and oranges into a common conversation is to use effect size. So it's a statistical review component. If that
and then
helps.
the question about the 0.29 for homework. So assigning homework makes the needle go down.
So homework depends on the grade level. And so at the elementary school level, they say pretty clearly that homework is not a great idea unless it's about family engagement and conversations. It's not about even solidifying skills. It's really about reading and about family connection time. Middle school, you can start to make a shift, but the research shows that it should be about 10 minutes per grade. So if you have a sixth grader, they should only be getting about 60 minutes. I'm sorry, 10 times the grade. So it should be about 60 minutes of homework per night for a sixth grader. When we get into high school, this changes significantly. So high school, the research has shown that homework is very beneficial for them as long as it is targeted on the skills they have learned in the classroom, and it's helping them refine those skills, and it's not trying to learn new content on their own. And so there you go.
And I might add that there's, as I click through these slides, that there is a lot of the research around homework has demonstrated that, especially at the elementary grades, parent frustration can get pretty high. And we actually know that when homework demands go down, domestic violence reporting goes down as well. So we know that at times homework can cause trauma in the home. And those of you that are parents, I'm sure you can remember some nights where you've gotten pretty frustrated with your own kiddo on behalf of homework. And so just want to emphasize that homework from a trauma-informed perspective, if it isn't really purposeful and clear, it actually can lead to more stress and trauma in the home. So we are going to try and do a breakout now. I know you've got it ready, Vince. And I'm wondering, Heather, do we want to stick with 7 minutes given our timing right now? It'll bring us back at 50.
Let's bump this one down to let's do 3 people, quick introduction, have a quick conversation, and then there's just a little bit of content before we go into the next breakout. So let's do that. So let's do like just a 3 minute, each person gets a little time to share.
So thank you for entertaining a quick conversation with each other. Heather, do you want to speak to this slide before we show the video?
Sure. We wanted to bring this back out again as a point of reference. So we're going to continue to grow a timeline of how are we moving through the world of special education services to really get to the inclusion model. And so we'll keep referencing these dots. In the video we're about to show you, she does a great job of talking about this. So I'm going to leave it to her to go a little deeper.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in 5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore. Today's topic is the evolution of inclusion. Okay, so you remember the dots? I know. I've shown you these before. But one colleague of mine suggested to me once, he goes, what if we didn't look at these as different concepts that we compare to each other, but instead as an evolution of time? It was totally brilliant. Now we can look at this timeline through the lens of any marginalized population, but to understand this timeline from the inclusion and disability perspective, we have to go back in time a little bit. Many of us know or are connected to someone who experienced institutionalization. It was even recommended to families by doctors. Although British Columbia was the first province in Canada to close down their institutions, there are still individuals living in these conditions across Canada today. The institutionalization movement is an example of exclusion. It separated individuals with disabilities from their families without choice. But the disability rights movement over the past 50 years, with the hard work of some incredible self-advocates and families, and maybe a little help from Geraldo with their pushed communities to shift so that individuals of all abilities were welcomed and living in the same settings as their family and friends. This shift from institutions to communities, this was the start of the inclusive evolution. We have movement, but can we do better? Although many individuals are no longer excluded from their families and communities, they were, and let's be honest, they still are, expected to attend segregated schools or self-contained special education programs that are totally separate from the rest of the school community. And so parents started to ask some very good questions. You see, children with disabilities have siblings without disabilities, and families wanted all their kids to have equitable access to community-based education together. Kids started to be integrated into classrooms with their peers. They're in math together. They're in gym class together. They're eating lunch together. Kids are together. This is better. The shift from segregated to integrated schools and classrooms, this is the next step in the evolution of inclusion. We have movement, but can we do better? Well, this is where things get tricky, because integration, it doesn't take long to realize that just being together, it's not enough. Although in the same classroom, students with disabilities are often just that. They're physically in the classroom. They may sometimes have parallel activities, but mostly it's loosely connected classroom tasks. Now, you don't need me to tell you that just physically sharing space and time is enough to make you feel like you belong in a community. I mean, come on, there are Disney movies made about this. Breathing the same air is not enough. Do you remember the Titans? I do. The evolution from integration to inclusion is now the topic of many conversations in communities and schools around the world. How do we support individuals to be meaningfully included and not just physically integrated? It's not just about where kids go in their day, but why. What is the purpose to the places that they go? It's now school-based teams and staff that are asking questions about how to do this. How can we support purposeful and meaningful placements for kids with disabilities? In inclusive classrooms and schools, students aren't just present, but they have roles and responsibilities in their classrooms and also meaningfully connecting to their peers. This is inclusion. So there you have it, my friends. A brief history of inclusion in about 5 minutes. If this is interesting to you, though, definitely investigate your local history as well, because every community is in a different place in this journey, and it's so valuable to know where we've come from. The other thing, though, is looking at these visuals as a timeline. It really helped me to shift my own thinking from which bubble am I at or not at, and shift to more about where are we now in our inclusive journey and what's our next step. All of a sudden, the goal of inclusion becomes action-oriented and just feels so much more possible. We may not all be at the same place in the journey, but we can all move forward. We can do better. And so this is the question I'm going to leave you with today. Can we still do better? Do you think there's another evolution in inclusion? What might that be? How can we inch even more forward to make inclusion even better? Thanks, Geraldo.
All right, so I'm thinking we were going to do this as a breakout, and for those of you that are excited to stay with us afterwards, but you're welcome to. But just want to give you a moment. We've presented so much information to you today, and given that you just watched this video, as well as the conversations we've had today, the conversations we had 2 weeks ago, just want to let you reflect for a minute. What are some new thoughts, understandings, wonders you have about your own current mental model of special ed? And what might it mean for you in the future to move towards a more inclusive model? So just going to let you sit with that. If you want to pop in the chat, you're welcome to. You don't have to.
Yes, it's on the slides. Absolutely. And I did link the slides earlier. I'll put the link in one more time here towards the bottom for you guys.
I like Carisha, hopefully I didn't say your name wrong, is saying concurrent service delivery. So that's what's on her mind. definitely thinking about how do we ensure multiple services are happening together, right? I think that's what you mean by concurrent, that we're not putting them off to be separate, but we're engaging them together. Any other thoughts folks want to share?
Yeah, I agree. I like the timeline piece that she shared. It gave it a different frame, and I think a more positive frame too, knowing that as we learn more, as we analyze practice, as we, talk to people who have gone through the world of special education services, what matters, what helps them, what moves the needle, and we're always refining. Education really is a practice.
Mm. Mm. John's asking a good question about students that I'm guessing students that struggle with behavior and regulation. I'm kind of reading between the lines of that. And so how do we ensure that those students can be included? And that's a great question to ask. And Heather and my husband on our team spent their initial lives as special educators in the EBD world. And I think we have a lot of thoughts about some evidence-based ways that we start to support those students to be successful in more environments than just the self-contained environment. Really takes us knowing the function of those behaviors and anticipating that and putting in some practices that help the student gain that function without being disruptive. So great question, John. And excited to, in the next few years, really help your system, because I know at the junior high, for example, that's already been identified. How do we better serve those kids in particular? What does that mean for our practice? Good questions about budgeting.
And Diane's asking a nice question about, what are the methods for inclusion? And this is part of the work, right? This is where the learning comes in. How do we support you guys with really thinking about what is universal design? What are the opportunities within universal design in a tier 1 setting for all students? How do we know what their strengths are so that we can build upon those? Just like for any child, whether they have a disability or not, we always want to think about, what do you do really well? How do you like to show what you know? And so really digging into, it's really that sense of belonging, the culturally responsive component, the equity component. How do we know our students as a whole child and really lean on their strengths in that environment?
I think also when I see Diane's questions also about asking about math, and it can be really hard conceptually when we know that there are skills that build upon themselves in math. So I think that's a great question to be asking. And there are some pretty profound ways to think about how do you continue to beef up students if they're missing some skills or lagging skills mathematically, but maintain access to the conceptual learning in math. And what does that look like differentiating in practice? And Jordan's asking a great question about resources. I know that your district is committed to this work over time, and the state is committed right now to funding this work. But I don't know if anyone from the system level wants to speak to that resources question, or maybe at another time. But you're right. This is not something that's going to happen right away. It's something that's going to take a lot of focused effort. And what I'm hearing from your superintendent and your school board is this is the work. So I think you've got commitment at the highest level to dedicate resources to this. And I heard your superintendent mention that as well. Diane's bringing up class size. Yep. So that's really a lot of what you're asking, Diane, I think is about MTSS on its own, in terms of how are we even identifying amongst those 30 kids, what are their current abilities and capacities and skills within math and reading, for example, and then what are our ways to pull in interventions when needed to ensure those kids can be successful. That's really MTSS work, data-informed MTSS work. And Mary's responding around supporting this in the strategic plan, which is exciting. So it's 2:58, and yeah, absolutely, Matt. This is about aligned P12 work over time. Absolutely. So wanted to let you guys know we're excited. When we see you in a month, we're going to be getting into data. We've talked a lot about data. We're going to actually start to look at it. And that's going to include, thank you for taking the panorama survey you just did. We've seen those results. We will be sharing them with you then, as well as by then we will do some student measurements. So we'll be able to look at staff perception and student perception, as well as what is this LRE data telling us? Why is Mount Baker a district that was encouraged to do this work? Well, we need to look at how many students are in the least restrictive environment and what percentage of their day is spent in a least restrictive environment. We're going to look at that data together next time and support you in March and April on your asynchronous learning to look at that data with your team and start to unpack it a bit. So in the meantime, please give us feedback. We are really curious how much progress you've made with your norming. And we want to make sure that what you do in March for asynchronous learning continues to feel manageable. We got a lot of feedback that it felt like a lot. So we're going to make some changes to the technical aspect. And we also just want to respect your time and finishing those norms, making sure you've calibrated those norms and you have some ways to repair when they're broken. Those are important steps. So please be honest in the feedback and let us know, have you gotten to that step or not? Because if you haven't, then we want to make sure your time in March is dedicated to that so we can move forward with data from there. And it is 3. You are welcome to go. And if you want to stay, we are going to stay for an extra half an hour. We're happy to answer questions. We can go into breakout rooms. We can get back into some of what we weren't able to talk about. But that is an invitation, not a demand by any means.
Thank you all. We appreciate your feedback. Please
And
follow the link.
please, yes, thank you, Vincent. And the feedback links are in there a couple of times. Yes. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for being here, everybody.